Hello, IB English students. Sorry I couldn't be in class with you to do this in person, but I am picking up my residency stuff in Austria, so I've made this video for Mr. Burrell to play and to make this as interactive as possible. This is all set up for your first dirt test for the first chunk of Watchmen tomorrow on Tuesday. What we'll need to do is you'll need to grab that handout from Mr. Burrell with this scene, and then it will help later on to have your reading questions open for Watchmen, your dirt prep sheet. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is I need you to take the time now to answer these three questions. Please kind of take your turns, raise your hand, and Mr. Burrell, if you can field these, I'll just start our 3-minute timer. Right, in this scene, after you read it over to yourself, identify who these characters are. You can use both their superhero name and their civilian names. What is important to know about their relationship within this scene? And then what happens prior to this scene that is also important for the reader to know. Please take a couple minutes now and share answers to those three things with Mr. Burrell. And when Mr. Burrell, the video will automatically advance after the timer reaches 0. Okay, so moving forward, right? The next thing that I would like you to do in small groups, take the next 3 minutes or so, is, whoops, sorry about that, let me go back, is to answer these three questions. Why is this scene included or important to the overall story? We're just talking about the author's, the plot, or the purpose behind the plot here. What are we learning about these key characters early on that we should probably pay attention to as the story progresses? And then lastly, how does this scene set up one or more of the conflicts that these characters are experiencing and or that they will eventually experience later on down the road? You should be able to answer these three questions given what you've read in chapters 1 through 4, right? This scene comes from chapter 1. Kind of, again, raise your hand, share your answers to these three questions amongst yourselves, share them with Mr. Burrell. And if you'd like, and it'd be a good idea, on the back of this sheet of paper, there's plenty of space. You'll be using that to write a claim or a thesis statement later on. But if you want to write down anything from your discussions, that would be a good place to place it. So take the next 2 minutes, answer these 3 questions, and record your answers on the back of that sheet of paper. Okay, so then the next thing that we would focus on is discussing the author's purpose as far as the theme is concerned, right? Which of the 7 line of inquiry topics that we see down here below makes sense that which of these 7 things does this scene touch on? Or do you think that this scene has a message about identity, culture, creativity, communication, transformation, perspective, or representation? And then more specifically, what message or lesson about that topic does the author seem to be communicating? For the purposes of focusing our efforts today, I'm going to tell you that this scene has a message about identity. Please take a minute or 2 and think about or do some brainstorming about what do you think that message is? What do you think Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons are trying to say about someone's identity using just this scene? Give you about 30 seconds to kind of think about that, maybe jot down an idea on the back of your paper, and we'll come back to it. All right, 10 more seconds, then we're going to move forward. Okay, so for this next part, I'd like you to take the next 10 minutes and working in small groups, working with partners, etc. I'd like you to identify what are the literary devices that are being employed in this scene and how are they being used to help communicate that message about identity in the scene. And then also what visual devices are being used in this scene and how are those connected to that message regarding identity. You might want to ask yourself, how is this helping to advance the plot? But more importantly for our purposes is how is this linking to a larger universal message about identity? We'll take the next 9 minutes or so, talk amongst yourselves. Mr. Burrell, if you can circulate around the room and kind of encourage people, chime in when you hear a good idea. And again, please record your ideas on the back of your sheet of paper. The video will advance to the next slide after the timer elapses. one more minute to share out those literary as well as visual devices that you found in the comic and how they are related to the author's message about identity. Okay, so if we take a look at this, excuse me, I compiled a list of things that might have come up in your conversations. If you don't have some of these things, you might want to just add them to your sheet of paper, either on the front in your annotations or on the back. So, did you discuss the use of color in this scene? Did you discuss Rorschach's speech pattern? Notice that he only speaks in fragments. Rarely does he ever speak in full sentences. Why might that be important? Did you talk about the shape of Rorschach's speech bubbles? The fact that his are not smooth like Dan's, but have this wavy, erratic nature to them. What might that indicate about the way he's talking, about his speech, his personality, etc.? By contrast, did you look at Daniel's speech pattern? Notice that he speaks almost completely in full sentences, but he also stutters several times. Notice that the use of syntax there is important. What might that be indicating about him as a person, but then also how can you link that to the author's message about identity? Did you discuss the use of moment-to-moment transitions here? Instead of subject to subject, right, because it's the same two subjects the whole time. Instead of that, the author decided to use moment-to-moment transitions. You might want to look back at our notes as to why an author would decide to do that. How does that also help the authors build their message about identity? Did you notice anything interesting or different about the panel layout? Notice that in the previous pages before this one comes up, you should be used to the 12 panels per page format, right? There's always 4, 8, and 12, but in this scene, it gets interrupted. You have a splash panel here, thinking about why that might be important. Did you notice the camera zoom in panel 4, right? The fact that instead of staying right here where it is and then depicting the same thing, that the camera zooms in over Dan's shoulder. Did you notice the symbolism of the cracked wall in panel 5 and the spill on the floor? Why might that be important? How might that also be connected to the author's message about identity? And lastly, did you pay attention to Daniel's body language? Right? The way that he situates himself, the way he carries himself, etc., and how that might also be important for conveying the author's message about identity. Sorry. And hopefully you can see on the board, did you also note that what Daniel has in his hand? You should have noticed that it's the comedian's button, the smiley face with the drop of blood on it that Rorschach took from the murder scene earlier in the chapter. Why might that be important? And how might it be a symbol for something greater or more important, especially when it comes to the author's message about identity in this scene? So the last thing that you're going to do today on the back of that sheet of paper is you're going to take all the notes that you put together and construct a thesis statement. And you can use this top one here or you can use the bottom one. And in the brackets is where you actually put in, the answers that you would discuss if you were going to do an analysis of this scene. So for example, if you did the top one, right? In the graphic novel Watchmen, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons use list all the devices that you were planning on using, to convey an important message about, and then this would say identity. They want readers to understand, insert your message about identity. Notice that in this first bracket, it should be both the text-based devices that they use and the visual devices. Or if you want to, it's the same thing, you don't write it twice, but if you'd like this structure better, right? Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons use blank in Watchmen, right? All those devices, too, and then add in, like, what is the purpose as far as the plot is concerned. They also use these devices to convey an important message about identity, which is, and then fill in whatever that message is that you've agreed upon as a class or in a small group. What is the author's message about identity in this scene? When you're finished with that, you're going to hand that sheet of paper with your name on it to Mr. Burrell. He's going to collect that, and I will record your grade and get that back to you tomorrow for you to use while you're working on your DIRT test. I'm going to move forward real quick. This is what your testing screen will look like tomorrow. So when you come in, you'll be getting a random scene from chapters 1, 2, 3, or 4. I'll tell you what chapter it's on, or sorry, what chapter it comes from and what page it's on. That way you can open the book and look at it. You will also have a colored printout copy of the passage to work with. You'll also have a focus question. It looks very similar to what you worked on today. How do Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons use stylistic and visual devices to convey a message about, and then at the bottom of your sheet of paper, depending on what scene you get, it'll tell you which line of inquiry topic you're supposed to focus on. Just as a reminder or piece of clarification, you don't have to put in citations after you describe what is going on a page. You only need to add in citations after you've used a text-based quote. Right, when you're talking about the dialogue that the characters say back and forth to one another. You'll have your citation key down at the bottom, right? For example, right, Dan asked Rorschach, quote, whatever happened to them? Then in parentheses it should say Moore and Gibbons. The first number you see is the chapter number, then a comma, and then the second number is the page number. So if our scene, the one that we looked at today, came from chapter 1, page 13, that's what our citation would look like. You will enter the correct information depending on what scene you end up with tomorrow during your DIRT test. And just like all your other timed writings, you're expected to produce at least 3 paragraphs. Your introduction paragraph, which summarizes the scene and gives a thesis statement, 1 body paragraph to talk about the use of one device. You can do that like all about the text. And then a second body paragraph with a transition to talk about a second device, which if you wanted to, you can make that second body paragraph the visual device. Or, just like what you did with the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, you can talk about text and visuals in the first body paragraph, and then talk about text and visuals again in a different panel or a different part in body paragraph 2. If you have time and you write a third body paragraph, that serves as restorative points. All right. So again, what I would suggest before you come into class tomorrow, right, skim through chapters 1 through 4. You don't have to reread them, but just go through, refresh your memory. You also might notice something now that we've had our discussion earlier today. You might notice something you didn't notice before. It'll be good to kind of add to your notes. Please make sure that you look at my feedback on your prep sheets. I will not be able to give feedback after 7 p.m., so please make sure you turn that assignment in on time. I will have office hours on Tuesday and Wednesday this week, so if anyone needs me, you can come find me then. And then I'm going to move this back. And then Mr. Burrell, if you can leave this slide on the board for students so they know that this is the last thing that they complete before they hand that into you. Thank you, everybody, and I will see you tomorrow.